After my husband's affair with my sister destroyed everything, my marriage, my career, even my will to keep going, he told me I'd always be nothing without him. Living in a weekly rate apartment with barely enough for groceries, I received a certified letter about an inheritance I never knew existed. Inside that envelope was $85,000 and instructions that led me to discover a truth so devastating, it made the affair look like child's play. What I found didn't just give me revenge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It gave me an empire worth more than my ex could ever dream of. 6 months ago, I had what most people would call a decent life. Now I'm standing in a 400 square foot studio apartment in the cheapest building I could find in Sacramento, eating dollar store pasta for the 4th night in a row, trying to figure out how I'm going to make rent next week. The apartment smells like the previous tenant's cigarette habit mixed with whatever cleaning solution the landlord used to pretend he'd done a deep clean. The carpet has stains that tell stories I don't want to know. The bathroom sink drips constantly, and the super never returns my calls. The window looks out onto a parking lot where someone's car alarm goes off at random hours, and my neighbors argue loud enough that I know way too much about their relationship problems. This is what rock bottom looks like for me. This is what happens when your husband sleeps with your sister, and somehow you end up being the one who loses everything. My name is Kara Wilkes, and I used to work as a senior project manager at Redstone Construction, a commercial development firm that handled shopping centers and office buildings across Northern California. I made $72,000 a year, had a 401k, health insurance that actually covered things, and a 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood where people still said hello when you walked your dog. I'd been married to Evan Harrison for 6 years. We met at a company mixer when I was 26 and stupid enough to believe that charm and good looks meant someone was trustworthy. He worked in commercial real estate investment, or at least that's what he told me. His schedule was always irregular, late nights reviewing proposals, weekend trips to tour properties, conference calls at strange hours with East Coast investors. I believed all of it because I wanted to believe it. Because questioning your husband feels like questioning reality itself. My sister Maggie had always been the golden child in our family. 3 years younger than me, prettier in that effortless way that made people do things for her without asking. She'd moved to Sacramento 2 years ago after dropping out of yet another graduate program, and I'd helped her find an apartment, co-signed her lease when her credit wasn't good enough, let her crash on our couch during the transition. She came over twice a week for dinner. She borrowed my clothes, my car, my makeup. She called me when she had problems with whatever guy she was dating or whatever job she'd just quit. I was the responsible older sister, and she was the one who needed taking care of. That's how it had always been. Except she'd been sleeping with Evan for at least a year, maybe longer. And when I finally caught them, walked in on them in my own bedroom, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when I'd come home sick from work, neither of them had the decency to look ashamed. Maggie had actually rolled her eyes at me, like I was the one being dramatic by being upset. Evan had just started getting dressed with this calm efficiency that told me this wasn't the first time he'd been in this exact situation. That was 4 months ago. Within 3 weeks, I'd lost my job. My boss Chuck Mickelson called me into his office and told me the company was restructuring, and my position was being eliminated. Never mind that we just landed 2 major contracts. Never mind that I'd been employee of the quarter 6 months earlier. The severance package barely covered 2 months of mortgage payments. The divorce happened fast. Evan hired some aggressive attorney who painted me as unstable and financially irresponsible. Maggie actually testified at the proceedings, telling the judge that I'd been emotionally volatile and impossible to reason with for months before Evan had sought comfort elsewhere. The judge was a tired-looking man who seemed like he'd given up on justice somewhere around his 10,000th case, and he signed off on everything Evan's lawyer requested. I lost the house. Lost the car. Lost the furniture we'd bought together and the savings account I'd contributed to for 6 years. Walked away with my clothes, my laptop, and enough money to cover maybe 3 months of rent if I lived somewhere cheap enough. My parents took Maggie's side. Said I must have driven Evan away, that I needed to take responsibility for my part in the marriage falling apart, that Maggie was young and made mistakes, but she was still my sister and family forgives. I stopped answering their calls. Friends disappeared once it became clear I wasn't bouncing back quickly. Everyone's sympathetic when you're going through a divorce, right up until you actually need help. Then suddenly they're too busy, too stressed with their own lives, too uncomfortable with your situation, bringing down the mood. So here I am. Studio apartment that costs $950 a month, which is somehow the best I could find. Freelance work doing project coordination for small contractors, making maybe $2,000 a month if I'm lucky. Eating cheap pasta and trying not to think about how completely my life has imploded. The certified letter arrived this morning. Before everything fell apart, my life in Roseville felt solid in a way I'd stopped appreciating. I had routines that made sense. A morning coffee stop at the same place where the barista knew my order. A commute that took exactly 23 minutes if I left by 7:45. An office where I had my own desk with a window view and people actually listened when I talked in meetings. Redstone construction wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. We handled mid-sized commercial projects, strip malls, medical office buildings, the kind of developments that go up in suburbs and nobody really notices except the people who use them. My job was coordinating between architects, contractors, and clients, making sure projects stayed on schedule and under budget. I was good at it. Really good. I'd brought in 3 major clients in the past 2 years just through referrals from satisfied previous customers. Chuck Mickelson, my boss, had this habit of forwarding me the difficult clients, the ones who changed their minds every week or had unrealistic expectations about timelines. I'd smooth things over, restructure the schedules, find compromises that made everyone feel heard. "You're the only one who can handle Mrs. Patterson without losing your mind," Chuck would say, referring to a particularly demanding client who wanted a medical complex built in 8 months when the realistic timeline was 14. I'd made it happen in 11, and she'd written a letter to corporate praising the entire team. The office had this break room where everyone gathered around 3 p.m. for coffee and complaining. My colleague Shannon Holden and I would swap stories about our most ridiculous client requests. There was running joke about how many times someone would use the phrase, "I saw something on Pinterest," during a design meeting. Friday afternoons, a group of us would sometimes grab drinks at a bar 2 blocks away, nothing fancy, just unwinding after the week. It felt like belonging. Like I'd built something that mattered, even if it was just a career at a medium-sized construction firm and friendships with coworkers who knew my coffee order. My house was a 3-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood that had been built in the 90s. It wasn't new or impressive, but Evan and I had bought it together 5 years ago, and I'd spent weekends painting the kitchen a warm yellow color that made morning light look better than it actually was. We'd planted tomatoes in the backyard that never quite produced as much as the gardening blogs promised, but I'd kept trying anyway. Evan had seemed like a good match when we met. He was confident without being arrogant, at least that's how it seemed at the time. He could talk to anyone at parties, had opinions about restaurants and wine that made him seem sophisticated. He remembered details about my work and asked follow-up questions about projects I'd mentioned weeks earlier. Our wedding had been small, just family and close friends at a vineyard in Napa that we couldn't really afford but convinced ourselves was worth the splurge. Maggie had been my maid of honor, wearing a dress we'd picked out together after trying on what felt like hundreds. She'd cried during the ceremony, and I'd cried too, both of us emotional in that way sisters get at weddings. Looking back now, I can see moments that should have made me suspicious. The way Evan was always encouraging me to invite Maggie over for dinner. How he'd offer to pick her up when her car was in the shop, sometimes being gone for 2 hours for a trip that should have taken 40 minutes. The way he'd defend her when I complained about her flakiness or her habit of borrowing things and never returning them. "She's going through a hard time," he'd say. "You should cut her some slack. She looks up to you." I believed him because I wanted to believe that my husband cared about my family. That he was kind enough to be patient with my irresponsible younger sister. Maggie had always been the one who got more attention. Prettier, more outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of conversation. Growing up, I'd been the responsible one who got good grades and followed rules, while Maggie was the one who got away with things because she was charming enough that people forgave her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Our parents had this habit of excusing everything she did. Dropping out of college twice. She was finding herself. Getting fired from jobs for not showing up. The managers were too rigid. Maxing out credit cards and asking for money. She was going through a rough patch. I'd enabled it too. Co-signed her lease when she moved to Sacramento. Lent her money she never paid back. Listened to her complain about boyfriends who didn't appreciate her, about jobs that were beneath her talents, about how hard everything was for her. She'd sit on my couch every Tuesday and Thursday evening, drinking wine I'd bought, eating dinner I'd cooked, telling me about her problems. And I'd give advice that she never took, loan her money I never saw again, and feel like I was being a good sister. Evan would join these dinners sometimes, asking Maggie questions about her life, seeming genuinely interested in her latest drama. I'd thought it was sweet that he made an effort with my family. I'd thought a lot of things that turned out to be completely wrong. My grandmother Eleanor had died about 10 months before everything fell apart, before I caught Evan and Maggie, before I lost my job, before my life imploded. She'd been estranged from my father for decades over something nobody ever fully explained to me. I'd only met her a handful of times growing up, and she'd seemed stern and distant, the kind of relative you send obligatory thank you notes to but never really know. When she died, my parents didn't even tell me about the funeral. I found out weeks later through a cousin's Facebook post. At the time, I'd felt mildly hurt but mostly indifferent. Eleanor had never been part of my life in any meaningful way. I had no idea she'd been watching everything, documenting everything, preparing for exactly what was about to happen to me. The day I caught them started like any normal Tuesday. I woke up at 6:30, made coffee, checked my emails while Evan slept in because he said he had a late meeting the night before. I drove to the office, sat through a morning status update about a retail complex we were building in Elk Grove, and spent 2 hours reviewing contractor bids for a medical building project. Around 11 o'clock, I started feeling off. Not sick exactly, but wrong. My chest felt tight, my stomach kept churning, and I had this crawling sensation under my skin like something terrible was about to happen. I tried to push through it, but by noon I couldn't focus on the spreadsheet in front of me. Shannon noticed me staring blankly at my computer screen. "You okay? You look awful." "I think I'm coming down with something," I said, which wasn't exactly true but felt close enough. "Go home," she said. "The bids can wait until tomorrow." I packed up my laptop, told Chuck I wasn't feeling well, and drove home in the middle of the afternoon. The whole drive, that feeling of dread kept getting worse. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept checking my phone like I was expecting bad news, but there were no missed calls, no concerning messages. Just this overwhelming certainty that something was very wrong. When I pulled into my driveway, Maggie's car was parked on the street. That silver Honda Civic she'd bought used and immediately covered in parking lot dings. It wasn't unusual to see her car at my house. She had a key. She stopped by sometimes during the day to use my better internet connection or raid my pantry or just hang out because she didn't have anywhere else to be. But something about seeing it there at 1:30 on a Tuesday afternoon made my stomach drop. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine off, trying to talk myself out of the panic building in my chest. She was probably inside working on her laptop. Or maybe she'd stopped by to drop something off. Maybe Evan had come home early too, and they were just hanging out, completely innocent. I walked to my front door and used my key as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why being quiet felt necessary. The house was silent when I stepped inside. Not empty silent, but the kind of quiet where you know people are there but trying not to make noise. I stood in my own entryway, my work bag still on my shoulder, listening. That's when I heard Maggie laugh from upstairs. Not her normal laugh, that loud, attention-seeking laugh she used in public. This was different. Intimate. The kind of laugh meant for one specific person, designed to make them feel special. I'd heard her use that exact laugh years ago when she was dating someone she really wanted to impress. I remembered thinking at the time that it sounded calculated, performative. Now I was hearing it coming from my bedroom, and my brain was working overtime to construct explanations that would let me keep believing my life was what I thought it was. I walked up the stairs. Each step felt like it took an hour. I didn't call out to announce I was home. I just climbed those stairs in silence while my heart hammered and that sense of dread solidified into certainty. The bedroom door was partially open. I pushed it wider and saw exactly what some part of me had already known I was going to see. Evan and Maggie were in my bed. In the bed I'd slept in that morning. Tangled up in the sheets I'd washed 3 days ago. They looked comfortable together, familiar, like this was routine rather than a first-time mistake. When they saw me standing in the doorway, Maggie's first reaction wasn't shame or guilt. She rolled her eyes. Actually rolled her eyes like I was being unreasonable by having the audacity to come home to my own house in the middle of the day and interrupt them. Evan got out of bed and started pulling on his jeans with this calm efficiency that made everything worse. No panic, no fumbling, just the practiced movements of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly how to handle getting caught. "Kara," he said in that same reasonable tone he used when he thought I was overreacting about something. "Let's talk about this like adults." I just stared at him, my brain trying to process the audacity of that statement. I'd walked in on my husband in bed with my sister, and his immediate response was to suggest I was the one who needed to be more mature about the situation. Maggie sat up, holding the sheet around herself with false modesty that would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. "We didn't want you to find out this way," she said. "But honestly, Kara, this has been coming for a while. You had to know things weren't working between you two." The presumption in that statement hit me harder than the actual betrayal. Not just that she'd been sleeping with my husband, but that she genuinely thought I should have seen this coming. That somehow their affair was my fault for not noticing sooner, for not being interesting enough or attractive enough or whatever enough to keep my husband interested. I asked the question I knew I'd regret asking. "How long?" Evan pulled his shirt on, still using that infuriatingly calm tone. "Does it really matter?" "Long enough that we're sure about this. Long enough that pretending became harder than being honest." 14 months, Maggie said, with this edge of defiance in her voice. "Since right after I moved here. And before you make this into some dramatic thing, you should know that what Evan and I have is real. What you two had was just comfortable. Convenient. 14 months. Over a year of Tuesday and Thursday dinners where Maggie sat on my couch drinking my wine while sleeping with my husband. Over a year of me giving her advice and money and support while she was actively destroying my marriage. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things or make a scene. I just turned around, walked back downstairs, and started throwing clothes into a duffel bag I pulled from the hall closet. My laptop, chargers, toiletries, the practical things you need to survive when your life implodes. Evan followed me, still shirtless, still trying to have the adult conversation he'd mentioned, still acting like this was a reasonable situation that could be resolved through calm discussion and mature communication. I left without saying another word, walked out of the apartment I'd helped pay for, drove to a coffee shop parking lot 3 miles away, and sat in my car crying until I couldn't breathe properly. Then I called my cousin Daniela and asked if I could sleep on her couch for a few days while I figured out what to do next. That was 4 months ago. And now, sitting in this studio apartment with a certified letter in my hands, I was about to discover that Tuesday had been even worse than I'd thought. The betrayal hadn't just been personal. It had been calculated, planned, part of something bigger that I was only beginning to understand. I spent that first night in a hotel off Highway 80, one of those budget chains where they don't ask questions and the room smells like industrial carpet cleaner. Evan's texts piled up on my phone. "We need to talk about this rationally. You can't just leave without discussing things. I know you're upset, but this is childish." Maggie sent texts too. "I'm sorry you're hurt, but you're being dramatic. We didn't plan for this to happen." I blocked both their numbers around 2 a.m. and finally fell asleep with the television on because silence felt worse. My cousin Daniela let me stay in her spare room in Sacramento after that. She was the only family member who didn't immediately take Maggie's side, though even she seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation, like my presence was a reminder of messy things she'd rather not think about. I kept going to work every day, showing up at 8:30 like nothing had changed. I sat at my desk reviewing project schedules and writing emails and pretending I was fine. Shannon knew something was wrong but didn't push, which I appreciated. Chuck noticed I looked tired but didn't comment beyond asking if I was feeling better from whatever bug I'd had the week before. I lasted exactly 11 days before Chuck called me into his office. It was a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after I'd caught Evan and Maggie. I just finished a client call about a shopping center renovation, and I thought maybe Chuck wanted to discuss the timeline. Instead, he wore that expression I'd seen him use with contractors he was about to fire, professional sympathy mixed with firm resolve. "Kara, I need to talk to you about some organizational changes," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. The setup was obvious. This was how corporate people deliver bad news: soft opening, concerned face, passive language that distances them from the decision they're about to make. "The company's doing some restructuring," Chuck continued. "Budget constraints from the home office. They're eliminating several positions across departments, and unfortunately, your role is one of them." Budget constraints. We just signed a contract for a 4-building medical complex worth $18 million. I'd personally brought in 2 of our biggest clients this year. My last performance review had been glowing. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "We're not struggling financially. I just landed the Patterson account extension last month." Chuck wouldn't meet my eyes. "These decisions come from above my level, Kara." I pushed back, but the directive was clear. "I'm really sorry." He slid a folder across his desk. "Severance package, 2 months salary, continuation of health insurance for 60 days. Sign here, return your key card and laptop by end of day, security will escort you out." 2 months salary sounded generous until you divided it by the cost of rent and food and everything else you need to survive. It was barely enough to cover the mortgage on the house I no longer lived in and was about to lose in the divorce I hadn't officially filed yet but knew was coming. "Is this about Evan?" I asked, because the timing felt too convenient. Chuck's face flickered for just a second, guilt, maybe, or discomfort, before settling back into professional neutrality. "This is a business decision based on budget allocation. Nothing personal." But I'd been in enough corporate meetings to recognize what "nothing personal" actually meant. It meant someone had made a call, pulled strings, applied pressure. It meant my job had been a casualty of something I didn't fully understand yet. I packed my desk in a banker's box while security watched. 20 minutes to collect 4 years of my professional life, the framed photo of me and Shannon at a company retreat, the coffee mug from a client who'd sent a thank you gift, the desk plant I'd somehow kept alive for 3 years. My coworkers suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, avoiding eye contact as I walked past carrying my box of personal items like some kind of corporate criminal. Shannon caught me at the elevator. "This is bullshit," she whispered. "Everyone knows you're the best PM we have." "It's fine," I lied. "I'll figure something out." But it wasn't fine, and we both knew it. The divorce proceedings started 3 weeks later. Evan hired Elizabeth Chin, an attorney with a reputation for winning through strategic cruelty and procedural warfare. She filed motions that painted me as mentally unstable, using the fact that I'd abandoned the marital home and lost my job as evidence that I was incapable of adult responsibility. My attorney was court-appointed, an exhausted man named Nate Burt who seemed like he'd given up on justice somewhere around his 100th divorce case. He showed up to hearings with coffee-stained folders and filed responses that felt half-hearted at best. The judge was a man in his 60s named Harrison Kemp who moved through his docket like he was trying to set a speed record. Every motion Elizabeth filed, he approved with barely a glance at my attorney's objections. Every request Nate made on my behalf, Judge Kemp denied with the kind of efficiency that suggested he'd already decided the outcome before hearing any actual testimony. Evan kept the house because his name was first on the mortgage, even though I'd contributed equally to the down payment and 5 years of monthly payments. He kept the car we'd bought together because I'd missed a payment during the chaos of losing my job. He kept the furniture, the savings account, the retirement funds I'd been contributing to since I was 25. The settlement left me with my clothes, my laptop, and $8,000, barely enough to cover first month, last month, and deposit on any apartment that wasn't completely horrible. The worst part came when Maggie testified as a character witness. She wore a navy blazer I recognized immediately because I'd helped her pick it out 2 years ago when she was interviewing for a job she ended up quitting after 3 weeks. She sat in the witness stand with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, and lied with the kind of conviction that comes from genuinely believing your own rewritten version of history. She told Judge Kemp that I'd been unstable for months, that I'd made concerning comments about self-harm that had worried her, that I'd become increasingly paranoid and difficult to be around, that Evan had stayed in the marriage out of obligation and fear rather than love. None of it was true. Not a single word. But Maggie delivered each lie with perfect emotional calibration. Her voice breaking slightly at the right moments. Concern mixed with reluctance, like testifying against me was painful but necessary for my own good. Judge Kemp listened with sympathy, nodding, taking notes. When Nate tried to cross-examine her about her relationship with Evan, Elizabeth objected before he could even finish the question. The judge sustained it immediately, cutting off any line of inquiry that might establish when the affair had actually started or reveal that Maggie's testimony might be motivated by something other than concern for my well-being. I sat at the defendant's table watching my best friend, my sister, systematically destroy what was left of my credibility. And I understood that this had been coordinated. The affair, the job loss, the divorce proceedings, all of it timed and executed with precision that went beyond coincidence. What hurt almost as much as Maggie's betrayal was my parents' reaction. My mother called me the day after the divorce finalized. "Kara, you need to stop being so stubborn about this," she said, her voice carrying that disappointed tone I'd heard my entire childhood whenever I didn't live up to expectations. "Maggie is your sister. Family forgives. You're making this harder than it needs to be." "She slept with my husband for over a year," I said, my voice flat. "She testified against me in court with lies. She made a mistake. She's young. You're the older sister, you should be setting an example of grace and maturity, not holding grudges." "Where's Dad?" I asked. "He agrees with me. He thinks you drove Evan away by being too focused on work, too controlling. Sometimes men need understanding and softness, Kara. Maybe this is a lesson about what really matters in a marriage." I hung up without responding. The idea that I'd somehow caused Evan to cheat, that I was responsible for Maggie's choices, that I owed them forgiveness because, family, it was too much. My parents had picked a side, and it wasn't mine. That phone call was the last time I spoke to either of them for years. After the divorce finalized, Emma let me stay in her guest room for 3 weeks before her husband David started making pointed comments about how I needed to get my life together. I'd hear him talking to Daniela in their bedroom at night, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "She can't stay here indefinitely. You're not helping her by letting her avoid dealing with her situation. She needs to find her own place and start rebuilding instead of hiding here." Daniela would defend me in a tired voice that suggested she was running out of arguments. "She's going through a difficult time. She just needs a little more support until she gets back on her feet." But I could hear the doubt creeping in. The exhaustion of dealing with someone else's crisis. I started looking for anywhere else to go before Daniela had to ask me to leave and we both had to pretend it wasn't uncomfortable. My former colleague Diane offered her couch for 10 days. Then she decided my presence was bringing negative energy into her space and she needed to focus on her own mental health. A friend from college said I could stay with her for a week, then remembered she had family visiting and needed the spare room. Another friend let me sleep on her couch for 5 days before her roommate complained about having a stranger in their apartment. Everyone was sympathetic right up until sympathy became inconvenient. Right up until supporting me required actual sustained sacrifice rather than just kind words and temporary gestures. Then suddenly they remembered prior commitments, family obligations, personal boundaries that meant I needed to become someone else's problem. I understood it on some level. Nobody wants to live with someone else's crisis indefinitely. Nobody wants their home to become a shelter for a friend who can't get her life together. When I finally scraped together enough money from freelance social media work to pay for a weekly rate at a studio apartment, it felt less like hitting rock bottom and more like finally finding ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. At least rent didn't pretend to care. At least the landlord didn't offer false comfort or temporary sympathy that would evaporate when I became inconvenient. The studio apartment I found was in a complex off Stockton Boulevard that advertised affordable living, code 4. We fixed the bare minimum to pass inspection. The building was beige stucco with rust stains under every window where the rain gutters had failed years ago. The parking lot had more potholes than pavement, and the dumpster area attracted raccoons that had lost all fear of humans. My unit was on the second floor, accessible by an exterior staircase that wobbled when you walked up it. The door stuck in the frame, requiring a specific combination of shoving and jiggling the handle to get it open. Inside was 400 square feet of beige carpet, beige walls, and a kitchenette with a 2-burner stove, a mini fridge, and exactly 18 inches of counter space. The bathroom sink dripped constantly. I'd put in 3 maintenance requests in the first month, and the super had ignored all of them. The closet was so small I had to choose between hanging clothes or storing shoes. There wasn't room for both. The window looked out onto the parking lot, giving me a perfect view of my neighbors' cars and the ongoing drama of who was parking in whose assigned space. This was home now. This was what my life had been reduced to. I set up a routine because routine was the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. Wake up at 7 o'clock, make instant coffee using the electric kettle I'd bought at a thrift store. Sit at the folding card table that served as both desk and dining area, spending mornings applying for jobs. Project manager positions at construction firms that never called back. Coordinator roles at development companies that sent automated rejection emails. Administrative positions at places that wanted someone with more recent stable employment. My resume showed a gap of 3 months now, and that gap grew wider every week, making me less employable with each day that passed. Afternoons meant freelance work. Small contractors who needed someone to coordinate subcontractors or manage schedules for residential remodels. The work paid poorly and arrived sporadically, maybe $2,000 a month if I was lucky, barely enough to cover the $950 rent with a little left over for food and utilities. I bought groceries at the discount store 2 miles away, the kind of place where everything is slightly off-brand and the produce looks tired. Pasta that cost 89 cents a box. Canned sauce that was more sugar than tomatoes. Frozen vegetables in bulk bags. I ate the same meals on rotation because cooking for one person in a kitchenette with no storage space meant keeping things simple. Dinner was usually pasta or rice with whatever protein was cheapest that week, eaten while sitting on my bed because the card table was covered with my laptop and work papers. I'd watch streaming shows on my phone to fill the silence, not because I cared about the shows but because the alternative was sitting alone with my thoughts. My neighbors were mostly invisible. There was a guy in the unit next to mine who worked night shifts and came home at 3 a.m., his footsteps heavy on the exterior stairs. A woman across the parking lot who had a small dog that barked at everything. A family with kids who yelled at each other in a language I didn't recognize, their arguments carrying across the courtyard at unpredictable hours. I avoided looking at myself in the bathroom mirror for too long. The woman staring back looked hollow in a way that had nothing to do with weight loss or lack of sleep. Something fundamental had broken behind her eyes, leaving her looking defeated in a way that made me ashamed. My parents called twice in the first month after the divorce. Both times, my mother asked if I'd apologize to Maggie at 4, making things awkward, by refusing to accept her relationship with Evan. Both times, my father suggested that maybe I should think about what I'd done to drive my husband away, that marriage takes 2 people and I needed to take responsibility for my part in the failure. I stopped answering their calls after that. Daniela let me stay with her for 2 weeks before her husband started making pointed comments about how I needed to get back on my feet and stop wallowing. I heard them arguing about me through the walls of their house, his voice insistent that they couldn't become a permanent shelter for my problems, her voice defending me but sounding increasingly tired. I moved out before she had to ask me to leave, because at least that way I could preserve some dignity. Shannon from work texted a few times in the beginning. Want to grab coffee, and how are you holding up? I made excuses until she stopped asking. It was easier than sitting across from her in some cafe and pretending I was doing fine when we both knew I was barely surviving. Friends I'd had from college, from previous jobs, from my old neighborhood, they all fell away with the same pattern. Initial sympathy and offers to help, followed by increasing silence when it became clear I wasn't bouncing back quickly. People have tolerance for other people's disasters, but that tolerance has a limit. Once you cross from temporary setback into actual ongoing crisis, people start avoiding you because your situation makes them uncomfortable. I spent evenings applying for jobs that wouldn't call back, working on projects that barely paid enough to matter, and wondering how my life had collapsed so completely in just 4 months. The certified letter arrived on a Thursday morning in late September, slipped under my door by a postal carrier who apparently couldn't be bothered to knock. I almost threw it away thinking it was junk mail or maybe a notice about late fees for something I'd forgotten to pay. But my name was handwritten on the envelope in careful script I didn't recognize. The return address was a law office in San Francisco, Whitmore and Associates. I opened it standing in my kitchenette, morning light filtering through the window making the dust particles visible in the air. Inside was a letter on heavy cream-colored paper with a law firm's letterhead embossed at the top. Dear Ms. Wilkes, we are writing to inform you of an inheritance from the estate of Eleanor Wilkes, who passed away 10 months ago. As the sole beneficiary named in her will, you are entitled to assets held in trust on your behalf. Eleanor was my grandmother. My father's mother, who I'd barely known growing up because she'd had some kind of falling out with my dad decades ago that nobody ever fully explained. I remembered meeting her maybe 3 times as a kid, a stern woman with sharp eyes who lived alone in San Francisco and sent birthday cards with crisp $20 bills inside but never came to family gatherings. She died last February, and nobody had even told me. My parents certainly hadn't mentioned it. I'd found out weeks later through a distant cousin's Facebook post about attending a small memorial service. The letter continued in formal legal language about probate proceedings and estate settlements, but one paragraph made my hands shake. The initial disbursement includes $85,000 in liquid assets, to be released immediately upon verification of identity. Additional assets including property holdings and investment portfolios will be detailed in a separate meeting at your earliest convenience. Please contact our office to arrange transfer of funds and review of the complete estate documentation. $85,000. I read that number 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. $85,000 from a grandmother I'd barely known, who'd died 10 months ago, and whose inheritance was only reaching me now, months after my entire life had fallen apart. The timing felt impossible. Too convenient. Too precisely positioned at the moment when I'd hit absolute bottom. I called the law office number. A receptionist answered on the second ring, and when I explained who I was, she transferred me immediately to someone named Gerald Whitmore. Ms. Wilkes, he said, his voice carrying practiced warmth. I'm glad you received our letter. Your grandmother was quite specific in her instructions about the timing of this disbursement. What do you mean, specific about timing? Papers shuffled on the other end. Eleanor established this trust 6 years ago with very particular stipulations about when you were to be notified. She specified that you were only to receive information about the inheritance if certain conditions were met. What conditions? I'm not at liberty to discuss the full details over the phone. But I can tell you that your grandmother left extensive documentation for you personally. She wanted you to receive it in a specific manner. The $85,000 is, according to her instructions, just the beginning. There's considerably more, but she wanted you to understand the full context before accessing it. My chest felt tight. How much more? That's something we should discuss in person. Your grandmother was very concerned about security and privacy regarding these assets. She believed there were people who might try to interfere if they knew about the inheritance, so she structured everything to protect it from legal challenges or unwanted attention. People who might interfere. Legal challenges. The same people who destroyed my job and my marriage? Can you tell me anything else? Gerald hesitated. Your grandmother spent the last several years of her life documenting something she believed was important. She left materials for you, files, recordings, written accounts. She wanted you to have all the information before making decisions about how to proceed. The $85,000 is meant to give you immediate stability and resources to travel to San Francisco for the meeting. Travel to San Francisco? Yes. She left materials that can't be transmitted electronically or through mail. They need to be reviewed in person, at a specific location. I can provide you with the address and arrange access whenever you're ready. Who was she protecting this from? I think that's something you'll understand better after reviewing her materials. But I can tell you that Eleanor was extremely thorough in her documentation. Whatever she wanted you to know, she made sure there was evidence to support it. Evidence. Documentation. A grandmother I barely knew who'd apparently spent her final years preparing something for me, structuring an inheritance with conditions and security measures. The $85,000, I said. How quickly can that be transferred? We can initiate the wire transfer today if you can provide banking information and verify your identity. You should have access to the funds within 48 hours. I gave him my account information, the checking account I'd opened after the divorce with the $40 I'd had left after paying my first month's rent. The account that currently held $237 and was supposed to stretch another 2 weeks until my next freelance payment came through. I'll send you the address for the in-person meeting, Gerald continued. It's not our office. It's a property your grandmother owned in the Mission District. She left very specific instructions that you're to go there alone, and that you're to access a storage area on the property. Everything you need to know is there. After I hung up, I sat in my studio apartment staring at the letter. A grandmother who'd been estranged from my father, who I'd met maybe 3 times in my entire life, had left me $85,000 and, considerably more, along with mysterious documentation she'd spent years compiling. The inheritance was coming now, 10 months after her death, 4 months after my life had imploded. The timing felt deliberate, like Eleanor had somehow known I'd need this exactly when I'd hit rock bottom. 2 days later, the wire transfer appeared in my checking account. I logged into my banking app and stared at the number, $85,237. The extra $237 was my own money, but seeing it next to that huge deposit made it look absurd. For the first time in 4 months, I could breathe without the constant pressure of wondering how I'd make rent, whether I could afford groceries, what would happen if my car broke down or I got sick. But the relief was mixed with growing unease. Gerald's careful language about security and people who might interfere, Eleanor's specific conditions about timing, the mysterious materials waiting for me in San Francisco, none of it felt random. I booked a flight for the following Tuesday. Used some of the inheritance money for the first time, buying a ticket that cost $180 instead of searching for the absolute cheapest option. Felt guilty about the expense even though I had more money in my account than I'd had in years. San Francisco was only about 2 hours from Sacramento, but it felt like a different world. The address Gerald had given me was for a building on Valencia Street in the Mission District, a 3-story Victorian painted in shades of blue and yellow that stood out among the neighboring buildings. The flight took an hour. I spent most of it staring out the window, watching the bay appear below, the city spreading out in blocks and hills. A rideshare dropped me off in front of the Victorian on Valencia Street just past 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The building looked exactly like the photos I'd seen online. The ground level had a small cafe that seemed to be closed for renovation, windows covered with brown paper. A narrow door to the left had buzzers for the upstairs units. Gerald had given me a code for the main entrance and keys for Unit 3B. I punched in the numbers, heard the lock click, and stepped into a hallway that smelled like old wood and coffee from the cafe below. The stairs creaked as I climbed to the 3rd floor. Unit 3B was at the end of the hallway. The key turned smoothly. I stepped into an apartment that was clearly vacant but maintained, hardwood floors, high ceilings with original molding, large windows letting in afternoon light. The main room was empty except for a single filing cabinet against one wall and a folding table with a chair. On the table sat a laptop, plugged into the wall, its screen dark. Next to it was a manila envelope with my name written in careful handwriting. I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper. Kara. If you're reading this, then my timing was correct. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you any of this while I was alive, but you wouldn't have believed me. You would have thought I was a bitter old woman making up stories about your father's business dealings. And maybe you would have been right to think that. But now that you've lost everything the way I knew you would, maybe you're ready to see the truth. Your husband Evan didn't meet you by accident. Your marriage wasn't real. And the affair with your sister wasn't a spontaneous betrayal, it was the end stage of a plan that's been running since before your wedding. I've spent the last 6 years documenting everything. I knew your father would never protect you from what was coming. He's too invested in maintaining his relationship with the people who own him. So I did what I could to make sure you'd have the resources to fight back when the time came. Everything you need is in the filing cabinet and on the laptop. Bank records, emails, recorded conversations, photographs. I hired investigators, paid for surveillance, collected evidence that proves exactly what was done to you and why. You have 2 choices now. Take the money I've left you and disappear. Build a new life somewhere far from Sacramento and everyone who destroyed your old one. I've set up the inheritance to protect it from legal challenges, so you'll be comfortable. Or use what I've collected to burn down the people who thought you'd be easy to destroy. I hope you choose to fight. But I'll understand if you don't. Your grandmother, Eleanor. My hands trembled as I set down the letter. I crossed to the filing cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were folders organized by year and subject. The first one I grabbed was labeled Evan Harrison, Background and Recruitment. Inside was basically a full spy dossier on my own husband. Photographs of Evan from 8 years ago, before I'd supposedly met him. Him sitting in what looked like a corporate conference room with 3 other men I didn't recognize. The caption said, Redstone Construction Planning Meeting, March 2017. March 2017. 2 months before I'd met Evan at that company mixer. Another photo underneath, Evan shaking hands with Chuck Mickelson outside a restaurant I recognized in downtown Sacramento. The date stamp said January 2017. 4 months before we'd met. The next folder contained emails printed out and highlighted. The first one made my stomach drop. From Chuck Mickelson to Evan Harrison subject, the Wilkes situation. Evan, confirming our discussion about Kara Wilkes. Father is concerned about her access to family business information through her grandmother. Eleanor has been asking questions about the rezoning deals and making noise about investigations. Richard wants insurance in case she starts sharing documentation with Kara. Getting close to the daughter seems like the cleanest approach. She's isolated from Eleanor already due to the family estrangement. If you can establish a relationship, we'll have leverage and early warning if Eleanor makes any moves toward exposure. Let me know when you make contact. The timeline is important. We need this in place before the Harbor Point development breaks ground. I had to read it 3 times before it fully registered. Chuck and Evan discussing me like I was a problem to be managed. My father being concerned about what my grandmother might tell me. A Harbor Point development I'd never heard of. The relationship I'd built with Evan, the marriage I'd believed in, all of it had been manufactured. I was never his wife. I was a surveillance target. I kept pulling files. More emails between Chuck and Evan spanning 7 years, discussing me, my work, my relationship with my grandmother, my distance from my father's business dealings. They tracked everything, when I'd last seen Eleanor, what we'd talked about, whether she'd mentioned anything about rezoning or development deals. Another folder contained surveillance photos. Me having coffee with Eleanor 3 years ago, one of the last times I'd seen her before she died. The photographer had captured us from across the street through the cafe window. Someone had been following me, documenting my interactions with my own grandmother. Then I found the folder labeled Maggie Wilkes, Recruitment and Deployment. Inside were emails between someone named Richard Holden and Evan, discussing my sister the way you'd discuss hiring a contractor. From Richard Holden to Evan Harrison subject, extended monitoring. The sister is the obvious solution. Kara trusts her completely, and Maggie is desperate enough for money that she'll cooperate. We can position her in Sacramento, establish regular contact, and use her to monitor whether Eleanor is feeding information to Kara. Evan's response: already made initial contact with Maggie through social media. She's receptive to the financial arrangement. Suggested she move to Sacramento and we'd help with relocation expenses. She thinks it's about business opportunities. We'll brief her on the actual objectives once she's committed. My sister hadn't just randomly decided to move to Sacramento 2 years ago. She'd been recruited. Paid to befriend me, to sit on my couch every Tuesday and Thursday, to monitor what I knew about whatever my grandmother was investigating. The affair wasn't Maggie falling for my husband. It was the next phase of a plan, a way to destroy my credibility and isolate me from anyone who might believe me if I started asking the wrong questions. I found bank statements showing payments made to Maggie every month for the past 2 years. $5,000 deposited into her account on the 15th of each month, listed as consulting fees from something called Harbor Point Development LLC. $60,000. That's what my sister had been paid to betray me. I pulled out more files, my hands shaking now, barely able to process what I was seeing. Recordings on cassette tapes labeled with dates and names. Financial documents showing my father's involvement in Harbor Point development. Environmental impact studies with notes in the margins saying, falsified per RW instructions, RW being Richard Wilkes, my father. And then I found the recording that made everything else make sense. The laptop on the table came to life when I touched the keyboard. No password required. The desktop showed a single folder labeled, For Kara. Inside were dozens of video files organized by date. The most recent one was labeled, Start Here, March 2024. I double-clicked it. Eleanor's face filled the screen. She looked older than I remembered, thinner, her skin almost translucent. She sat in what appeared to be this same apartment, probably at this same table. Her hands rested on the surface in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite obvious physical deterioration. Kara, she began, looking directly into the camera. If you're watching this, it means I'm dead and you found everything I left for you. It also means that my timing was right, that they've already destroyed your marriage and your job, just like I knew they would. She paused to take a sip of water from a glass just off camera. I'm going to tell you something that's going to make you angry, and you have every right to be angry. I knew what was going to happen to you. I knew they'd use Evan to monitor you. I knew they'd eventually destroy your marriage to discredit you, and I didn't warn you in a way you'd believe. Her face softened slightly. I tried. Do you remember your engagement party? I pulled you aside and told you something felt wrong about Evan. I said to be careful, to pay attention to how things didn't quite add up. You thought I was being paranoid. You told your father I was interfering, and he told you I'd been causing family problems for years, making accusations nobody believed. I did remember that conversation. I dismissed it as Eleanor being difficult, creating drama at what should have been a happy occasion. I'd actually apologized to Evan later for my grandmother's behavior. The truth is, I'd already hired investigators by then, Eleanor continued. I already knew Evan had been recruited specifically to get close to you. But if I'd told you that, you would have thought I was crazy. You weren't ready to believe that your father was involved in something corrupt, that your future husband was a plant, that your entire life was being manipulated by people with financial interests worth millions of dollars. She leaned forward slightly. So I did the only thing I could. I documented everything. I spent 6 years collecting evidence, building a case, and structuring my assets to protect them from the people who would try to seize them if they knew I was investigating. I made sure that when everything fell apart for you, and I knew it would, you'd have resources and proof. Eleanor coughed, covering her mouth with a tissue. When she pulled it away, I could see she was seriously ill, though she was trying to hide it. Your father, Richard Wilkes, has been part of a development consortium for the past decade. They specialize in commercial rezoning in areas that aren't supposed to be developed, protected watersheds, environmental conservation zones, residential neighborhoods with strict zoning laws. They bribe city officials, manipulate environmental impact studies, and push through developments that make millions while destroying communities. She picked up a document from off-screen and held it toward the camera. Harbor Point was their biggest project. A luxury commercial development on protected wetlands north of Sacramento. They falsified environmental studies, paid off 3 city council members, and rezoned 200 acres that were supposed to remain conservation land. The development was worth $340 million, and your father's consortium stood to make approximately $60 million in profit. Eleanor set down the document. I found out about it because I still had friends in city planning from when I used to work for the county. Someone sent me documents they thought seemed suspicious. I started digging, and the more I found, the more I realized this wasn't just one corrupt deal, it was a pattern going back years. She looked tired now, energy draining from her face. Your father knew I was investigating. He couldn't stop me directly without raising suspicions, so they decided to neutralize me by monitoring you. If I tried to give you evidence, they'd know immediately through Evan. If I started making public accusations, they'd discredit me by claiming I was a bitter old woman trying to manipulate my estranged granddaughter with conspiracy theories. Eleanor took another sip of water. They kept Evan in your life for 7 years because as long as he was there, they had control. They kept Maggie reporting on you because they needed redundant surveillance. And when I got sick and they knew I was dying, they decided it was time to end the charade. The affair wasn't personal, Kara. It was strategic. They needed to destroy your credibility before I died, and you potentially inherited evidence that could expose them. She smiled then, a grim expression. But they miscalculated. They thought destroying you would make you disappear, that you'd be too broken to fight back. They didn't account for the fact that you're Richard's daughter, and despite everything he is, he passed on a stubborn streak that doesn't know when to quit. Eleanor pulled out another document. In the filing cabinet, you'll find complete documentation of 12 years of corrupt development deals. Bank records showing bribes. Emails discussing environmental fraud. Recorded conversations where they discuss manipulating city officials. It's enough to trigger federal investigations, criminal charges, and civil lawsuits that could bankrupt everyone involved. She leaned back in her chair. The inheritance I've left you is substantial. The $85,000 is just immediate cash. There's also this property, a stock portfolio worth about $1.2 million, and a commercial building in Oakland that generates rental income of approximately $15,000 a month. All of it is structured in trusts that protect it from legal challenges. Your father can't touch it. The consortium can't seize it. It's yours, free and clear. Eleanor's face became serious. You have 2 choices, Kara. You can take the money, sell this property, live comfortably off the investments, and never look back. Move somewhere they'll never find you. Build a life that has nothing to do with Sacramento or your father or any of this corruption. I've made that option possible for you, and nobody would blame you for taking it. She paused. Or you can fight. You can take everything I've collected and hand it to federal investigators. You can expose your father, the consortium, everyone who participated in destroying protected land for profit. You can make them pay for what they did to you and to dozens of communities they've exploited over the years. Eleanor's face filled with something that looked like pride mixed with sadness. Fighting won't be easy. They have money, lawyers, political connections. You'll be threatened. You might be in danger. But Kara, if you fight, you might actually win. And even if you don't win completely, you'll make them pay a price for what they did. She smiled then, a crooked smile I remembered from the few times I'd met her as a child. Either way, you'll have a story worth telling. I believe in you, even if nobody else in this family does. Don't let them win. Eleanor reached for something off camera, then looked back at the screen. Oh, and one more thing. The real fortune I mentioned isn't just this property and the stocks. There's an account at Mountain Pacific Credit Union. Account number 7743. Password is your mother's maiden name, Barrett. That's where I've been moving money for years, protecting it from your father and anyone else who might come looking. Check the balance. Use it to fight or use it to run, but for God's sake, use it. The video ended with Eleanor reaching toward the camera, and then the screen went black. I sat staring at the blank screen, my whole body trembling. Then I pulled out my phone and searched for Mountain Pacific Credit Union's phone number. The call took 45 minutes of navigating automated menus before I reached a human being. I gave them the account number Eleanor had mentioned, and the representative went quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "Ma'am," she said finally, her voice suddenly much more professional. "I'm going to need to transfer you to our wealth management division. Please hold." Classical piano played underwater for what felt like an eternity. Then a woman named Patricia came on the line and asked me to verify my identity using my mother's maiden name as the password. When I gave her Barrett, she paused. "Ms. Wilkes, I'm looking at the account now. This is a trust established in your name by Eleanor Wilkes. The account contains stock portfolios, bonds, and liquid assets. The total current value is approximately $14.2 million. $14 million. The words didn't sound real. They sounded like dialogue from someone else's life. "The trust is structured to protect it from legal challenges," Patricia continued. "Only you can access these funds, and there are provisions that prevent seizure even in the event of lawsuits or bankruptcy. Your grandmother was very thorough in how she set this up." I sat in that empty apartment, surrounded by evidence of my father's corruption and my grandmother's 6 years of investigative work, and understood exactly what Eleanor had given me. Not just money. Not just evidence. A choice. And the resources to make that choice mean something. I chose to fight. Using the contact information Eleanor had left in her files, I called Agent Lisa Holden at the FBI's San Francisco field office. She answered on the third ring, her tone suggesting she was busy and didn't have time for whatever I was calling about. "This is Holden." "My name is Kara Wilkes," I said, hearing my own voice shake slightly. "My grandmother Eleanor Wilkes left me information about a case I think you've been trying to build regarding Harbor Point development and systematic corruption in Sacramento area commercial rezoning." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Where are you right now?" Lisa asked, her tone completely changed. "San Francisco. Mission District, at my grandmother's property. Don't leave. I'm coming to you. Don't talk to anyone else about this. Don't touch anything else in the apartment. And whatever Eleanor left you, just wait for me. I'll be there in 40 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. Lisa arrived in 35 minutes, which suggested she'd driven faster than was probably legal. She was in her late 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a blazer with an FBI badge clipped to her belt. She looked at me standing in Eleanor's apartment with a mix of skepticism and hope. "Show me," she said. I led her to the filing cabinet. Watched her face change as she pulled out folders and started reading. She put on latex gloves before touching anything, treating Eleanor's apartment like a crime scene that needed preserving. "Your grandmother was either the most thorough investigator I've ever encountered or she was completely brilliant," Lisa said after about 20 minutes of reviewing documents. "Probably both. This is enough to open a federal investigation. We're talking conspiracy charges, fraud, possibly more if we can establish the full scope. Kara, you just handed me a case that could take down an entire development consortium." The investigation that followed moved with bureaucratic slowness that Lisa assured me was normal when building cases against corporations with billions in assets and armies of lawyers. Subpoenas had to be drafted, reviewed, approved by judges. Bank records needed freezing. Former employees who'd been fired or quit under suspicious circumstances were interviewed. Lisa helped me find a small apartment in the Mission District, a one-bedroom in an old building with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that rattled whenever trains passed on the tracks 2 blocks away. It was infinitely better than the studio in Sacramento. I used money from Eleanor's trust to pay rent and buy groceries, living simply while the investigation churned forward. The foundation she'd built, the evidence, the protected assets, the careful structuring, was allowing me to do what she'd never been able to do while alive. Fight back without being destroyed in the process. I met with prosecutors every few weeks. They had detailed questions about every piece of evidence Eleanor had collected, asking me to explain timelines and relationships and conversations I'd overheard years ago that I hadn't understood were significant at the time. Lisa called periodically with updates that mostly consisted of, "We're making progress and don't talk to anyone about this." The waiting was harder than anything that had come before. I'd handed over everything Eleanor had collected, and now I was just existing in limbo, hoping that the machinery of justice would actually work. I hired Joyce Burt, an attorney who specialized in whistleblower protections. She was in her 50s with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that made me feel safer just sitting in her office. "The good news is that your grandmother structured your inheritance brilliantly," Joyce said after reviewing the trust documents. "Your grandmother locked everything down legally. Your dad can't touch this money, and neither can anyone else involved in this mess. You're financially secure regardless of how this plays out." For months after I'd first met Lisa in Eleanor's apartment, things started happening fast. It began on a Wednesday morning in early spring. The story was everywhere. Federal agents raided Harbor Point Development's headquarters in Sacramento. I watched it unfold on the morning news, agents in FBI windbreakers hauling out box after box while cameras caught everything. Employees stood in the parking lot looking confused and scared while their corporate empire came apart in real time. My father was arrested at his home in Granite Bay. News footage showed him being led out in handcuffs past the manicured lawn and luxury cars that represented everything he'd built through corruption. He kept his head up, didn't speak to the reporters shouting questions. But I could see something in his eyes that looked like disbelief, like he genuinely thought he was untouchable. Chuck Mickelson was arrested at Redstone Construction. The company immediately released a statement claiming they'd had no knowledge of his involvement in any illegal activities, that he'd been acting independently. Within 2 days, they'd fired him and scrubbed his name from their website like he'd never existed. 3 city council members were arrested the same day. A former environmental consultant who'd falsified impact studies. 2 real estate attorneys who'd facilitated the fraudulent transactions. The arrests kept coming over the next week as the investigation expanded. Judge Harrison Kemp, the man who'd presided over my divorce and ruled against me on every single motion, resigned from the bench with a brief statement about pursuing other opportunities. It didn't save him. He was indicted 2 weeks later for accepting bribes and manipulating court proceedings. My divorce case was among dozens being reviewed. A new judge took less than an hour to vacate the entire proceeding, declaring it invalid due to corruption and fabricated testimony. The court sent me a formal apology, 2 pages of careful legal language trying to convey remorse without admitting liability that might open them to lawsuits. I read it once and filed it away with all the other documents marking the destruction and slow rebuilding of my life. Lisa called me that afternoon to tell me all the arrest details. I watched the footage on repeat that evening, rewinding multiple times because apparently I'd developed unhealthy coping mechanisms around witnessing karma manifest in handcuffs and perp walks. Shannon from my old job texted me, "Holy shit, Chuck got arrested? Is this related to what happened to you?" I didn't respond, but seeing that message felt like small vindication. My parents' number appeared on my phone 6 times over the next week. I didn't answer. My mother left one voicemail, "Kara, your father needs you right now. This is a misunderstanding, and family needs to stand together. Please call us back." I deleted it without finishing. Maggie tried calling too. Left a voicemail crying about how she didn't know the development deals were illegal, how she'd just been doing what Evan told her, how she was sorry for everything. Her voice had that same performative quality it had always had, the tone she used when she wanted something and thought acting emotional would get it. I blocked her number. Civil lawsuits started filing within days of the arrests. Environmental groups suing for damages to protected wetlands. Homeowners whose neighborhoods had been rezoned without proper process. Investors who'd been defrauded by falsified property valuations. The legal actions piled up so fast that Harbor Point Development filed for bankruptcy protection within a month. Joyce advised me to stay in San Francisco. "Once the trials start and your role becomes public, Sacramento won't be safe for you. The people involved have lost everything, and desperate people do unpredictable things." I sold my studio apartment in Sacramento remotely, taking a loss on the lease but not caring because I had resources now. I moved into Eleanor's Mission District property permanently. It felt appropriate somehow, living in the space where my grandmother had recorded those videos and collected evidence that would ultimately destroy the people who destroyed me. The property was worth more than I'd initially realized. The ground floor cafe space had a tenant lined up who wanted to open a bookstore, and the 2 other residential units both had long-term renters. The income covered expenses with enough left over that I didn't need to work if I didn't want to. But I wasn't interested in just living off Eleanor's inheritance. I had other plans forming. The trials began 8 months after the initial arrests and stretched across nearly a year. Federal prosecutors had built their cases methodically, using Eleanor's evidence as the foundation. Richard Wilkes, my father, went to trial first. I attended every day, sitting in the back row of the courtroom in San Francisco's federal building. Joyce advised against it, said it would be emotionally difficult and potentially dangerous if anyone recognized me. But I needed to see it. The prosecution presented Eleanor's recordings early in the trial. The courtroom listened to my father's voice discussing how to neutralize me, how to destroy my credibility completely. He sat at the defendant's table in his expensive suit, posture rigid, while the jury heard him plot my destruction like it was a business strategy. He never looked back at the gallery. Never acknowledged my presence even though he must have known I was there. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showing he'd personally received $8.4 million from various development deals over 12 years. Emails where he coordinated bribes. Recordings of him discussing falsified environmental studies. Testimony from former employees. His defense attorney tried to argue that Richard had been a minor participant, following directions from others. But the prosecution had emails showing Richard specifically instructing consultants on how to manipulate data, how to make wetland damage appear minimal, how to hide protected species from impact assessments. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts on 17 counts including conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and environmental crimes, my father showed no visible reaction. The judge sentenced him to 26 years in federal prison and forfeiture of approximately $12 million in assets. At 63 years old, it was effectively a life sentence. Mr. Wilkes, the judge said before dismissing the court, you held positions of trust and influence in your community. You used those positions not to serve the public good, but to enrich yourself while causing significant environmental damage and corrupting democratic institutions. The sentence reflects the severity and duration of your crimes. The bailiffs led him away. He walked with his head up, maintaining dignity even in handcuffs. He still hadn't looked at me. Not once during the entire trial. I felt nothing watching him disappear through the door to the holding cells. No satisfaction, no grief, no anger. Just hollow closure. Chuck Mickelson took a plea deal in exchange for testimony against other consortium members, reducing his sentence to 12 years. Part of the deal included admitting that he'd coordinated my firing specifically to destabilize me before Eleanor's death. We needed her isolated and financially vulnerable, Chuck testified. Richard was concerned that if she had stable employment and resources, she might investigate after Eleanor died. The plan was to eliminate her job, destroy her marriage, and ensure she was too focused on survival to ask questions. Hearing it stated so plainly should have made me angry. Instead, it just confirmed what I already knew. They'd underestimated me. Evan's trial happened 9 months after my father's. He tried to present himself as a victim manipulated by older, more powerful men. His attorney painted him as young and naive when first recruited. But the prosecution had 7 years of emails showing Evan enthusiastically reporting on my activities, suggesting strategies, collecting payments. The jury heard recordings of him discussing how to manage the affair with Maggie to cause maximum damage to my credibility. They convicted him on conspiracy charges, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced him to 14 years. When the verdict was read, Evan looked across the courtroom directly at me for the first time since the trial started. Anger mixed with something that might have been regret or just resentment at getting caught. I held his gaze without blinking until the bailiffs moved to take him into custody. Maggie never went to trial. She accepted a plea deal that reduced her charges in exchange for testimony. Her sentencing hearing was brief. The judge gave her 6 years, noting that while she'd participated willingly, she'd been less central to the overall scheme. I received a letter from her 3 weeks after sentencing. 5 pages written on prison stationery, full of apologies and explanations about being desperate for money, how spending time with me had been complicated because she'd actually started to feel guilty. The letter ended with, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but you're still my sister. Maybe someday, after I've served my time and proven I've changed, we could find a way to have some kind of relationship again." What we had wasn't all fake. Some of it was real, even if it started as a lie. I read it once while drinking coffee in Eleanor's apartment, watching morning light filter through the bay windows. Then I filed it away with all the other evidence of betrayal. Some relationships can't be repaired. Shouldn't be attempted. Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who systematically destroyed your life just because they later regret getting caught. While I filed away Maggie's letter unanswered, the legal machine kept grinding forward. The criminal trials were done, but the civil lawsuits were just beginning. The outcomes were substantial. Harbor Point and the consortium were forced to pay $420 million in damages to environmental restoration funds, affected communities, and defrauded investors. The Harbor Point property itself, those 200 acres of protected wetlands, was returned to conservation status. The partially completed development was demolished. I attended the ceremony where they officially redesignated it as protected habitat, watching bulldozers tear down the luxury shopping complex that had been built on fraud. My wrongful termination lawsuit against Redstone Construction settled for $340,000. I donated the entire amount to a legal fund that helps whistleblowers facing retaliation. I'd stopped needing the money by then anyway. Eleanor's inheritance had given me a foundation, but what I built on top of it became something she would have been proud of. I used the Mission District property as headquarters for the Eleanor Wilkes Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating development fraud and supporting people who expose corruption. I hired investigators, former journalists, retired law enforcement, people who knew how to trace financial records and identify patterns of bribery. We started small, following up on tips about suspicious rezoning deals, documenting cases where environmental studies seemed questionable. Within 2 years, our work had contributed to 3 federal investigations and stopped 2 fraudulent development projects before they broke ground. We'd helped 5 whistleblowers navigate the legal system. We'd published reports that made developers and city officials uncomfortable. The commercial building Eleanor left me in Oakland became a resource center. We offered free legal consultations for people facing retaliation. We maintained a database of corrupt practices. We trained community activists on how to recognize falsified environmental studies. I hired Shannon from my old job at Redstone. She'd been laid off 6 months after Chuck's arrest when the company downsized. Together, we built systems for tracking cases, coordinating with law enforcement, supporting people brave enough to come forward. "This is better than managing shopping center renovations," Shannon said one afternoon while we reviewed a case about questionable wetland permits in Fresno. "This actually matters." I thought about that a lot, about what actually matters. About how I'd spent years at Redstone thinking stability and paychecks were enough, not realizing I was part of a system that enabled exactly the kind of corruption Eleanor had spent her final years documenting. The foundation grew beyond what I'd initially imagined. We received grants from environmental organizations. Pro bono attorneys volunteered their time. Former government employees reached out offering to help investigate. Within 3 years, we had a staff of 12 and an annual budget of $2.4 million. I still lived in Eleanor's Mission District apartment. I'd renovated it, made it comfortable, but kept it modest. The oak floors had been refinished, the kitchen updated, but it wasn't lavish. It was home in a way my old house in Roseville never had been, because this space was built on truth instead of lies. Sometimes I thought about my old life, the routine of showing up at Redstone, the Thursday wine nights with Maggie, the comfortable illusion of a marriage that had never been real. It felt like remembering someone else's existence. I kept the receipt from my last month at the studio apartment in Sacramento in my wallet. $950 for a space that smelled like cigarette smoke and failure. I looked at it sometimes to remember that rock bottom is real, that humiliation and betrayal can strip away everything you thought defined you, but they can't actually destroy you unless you let them. Eleanor had understood that. She'd spent her final years building a case and assembling resources because she believed truth mattered more than comfort and justice mattered more than safety. The foundation's biggest success came 3 years after I'd started it. We'd been investigating a development consortium in San Diego trying to rezone coastal wetlands for a luxury resort. Our researchers found connections to some of the same attorneys and consultants who'd worked on Harbor Point. We documented falsified environmental studies, traced payments to city officials, and handed everything to federal investigators. The resulting case led to 4 arrests and stopped the development before ground was broken. The wetlands were permanently protected. The communities that would have been displaced stayed in their homes. I received a letter from one of the community activists who'd been fighting the development for years. She thanked the foundation for providing the evidence that finally stopped what seemed unstoppable. "You gave us the tools to fight back," she wrote. "You showed us that corruption can be exposed and stopped, that ordinary people can win against powerful interests if they have documentation and support." That letter sits framed on the wall in the foundation's office, next to a photograph of Eleanor taken decades ago when she was working for the county planning department. She's standing in front of a construction site, clipboard in hand, looking stern and capable. I'd never really known her when she was alive. By the time I was old enough to understand who she was, the family estrangement had already created distance. My father had made sure I saw her as difficult, paranoid, someone whose warnings could be safely dismissed. But she'd known me better than I'd known myself. She'd understood that I'd need to lose everything before I'd be ready to see the truth. That I'd need to hit absolute bottom before I'd be willing to fight instead of accepting whatever comfortable lies were offered. I'm not the woman I was when I opened that certified letter in my studio apartment. I'm stronger than she was, more careful about trust, but also more certain about what matters. That woman didn't understand how much she could survive or how powerful she could become when everything else had been stripped away. I'm grateful I'm not her anymore. The greatest revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you, though watching my father and Evan and everyone involved face consequences felt good in a way I won't apologize for. The greatest revenge is refusing to let corrupt people erase you from the narrative they've constructed around their own importance. It's building something meaningful from the ruins of a fraudulent life. It's turning pain into purpose. Eleanor left me more than money and evidence. She left me a choice. And the resources to make that choice actually mean something. I chose to fight. And in fighting, I found out who I really was underneath all the lies other people had built around me. That's worth more than any inheritance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.